Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's 4:15, so perhaps we can get started. Welcome to this special session organized by Ofcom on media plurality in an online world. For those of you who are not familiar with Ofcom, it's the communications regulator in the UK. My name is Luisa Fuso, and I am the Chief Economist at Ofcom. So today's special session is going to focus on a theme that's of particular importance to us, especially at this moment. Media plurality, as we know, is the cornerstone of a democratic society. It ensures that citizens have access to a plurality of views so that they are well-informed voters and can hold their elected representatives to account. To support this goal in the UK, there are long-standing media plurality rules that are aimed at ensuring that there is a sufficient plurality of news voices to choose from, and that no one has undue influence over the news we read. So Ofcom has a statutory duty to secure and maintain a sufficient plurality of news providers in the UK, established by the Communications Act 2003. Under the Act, we are allowed to conduct reviews of media ownership every 3 years. Now, our last review of media ownership rules was published in November 2021. And alongside that publication, we also launched a program of work on the future of media plurality in the UK. Really, the question that we are going to try and explore is what is the impact of the change in the news provision that we are experiencing? As more and more of us get our news from online intermediaries such as Facebook, Twitter, Google, and other platforms, a number of important questions have come to the fore, including news accuracy, sustainability, the impact of any potential bias in algorithmic curation, and the impact that all of these issues can have on plurality. Now, this session is going to debate some of these challenges and what are really the challenges arising from this intermediation and the impact, as well as potentially any solutions or interventions. I'm delighted to have with us an exceptional panel of speakers to discuss these issues with us today. First, we're going to hear from Simeon Thornton from Ofcom. Simeon is going to set the scene and discuss the issues that arise from this fundamental change in the provision of news and themes that our ongoing review is going to focus on. Simeon is a director of economics at Ofcom, where he leads on the economic analysis of media plurality. And before joining Ofcom, he was director at the UK's Competition Authority, the CMA, where he led a range of work relating to online platforms, including the market study on digital advertising, the one on mobile ecosystem, and the Competition Act case into Google's privacy sandbox with changes to the Chrome browser. Simeon will then be followed by Professor Andrea Pratt, who's going to present his recent research into how informed citizens are and how this varies with media consumption and other demographic characteristics. Andrea is the Richard Paul Richman Professor of Business at Columbia Business School and Professor of Economics at the Department of Economics at Columbia University. Before Columbia, Andrea was Professor of Economics at the LSE. Andrea's work focuses on organizational economics and political economy, and his current research in political economy attempts to define and measure the influence of the media industry on the democratic process. He's the author of numerous articles in leading journals, and in 2011, Andrea was elected Fellow of the British Academy. After Andrea, then Dr. Ruman Chaudhry is going to discuss some research into algorithmic amplification of political content on Twitter. Ruman is currently Director of Media Literacy, Machine Learning Ethics, Transparency and Accountability at Twitter, leading a team of applied researchers and engineers to identify and mitigate algorithmic harms on the platform. Previously, she was CEO and founder of Parity, an enterprise algorithmic audit platform company. Ruman is deeply engaged in AI global policy, and she serves as a board member of the UK Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, among others. She has helped to shape AI and digital policy as an advisor to various national and international bodies. Then after Ruman, Professor Rasmus Nielsen will discuss research focusing more closely on the UK, exploring the impact of intermediation on diversity and concentration of online news consumption and on the sustainability of publishers. Rasmus is director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and professor of political communication at the University of Oxford. His research is focused on the changing role of news and media in our society, and he has written extensively about journalism, digital media, the business of news, and political communication in a number of articles, edited volumes, and award-winning books. In addition, he is the co-author of the annual Reuters Institute Digital News Report. And Rasmus has provided expert advice to governments and news and media companies in several countries. Now, each speaker is going to speak for about 15 minutes, after which we will open to questions and discussion. Please submit your questions through the Q&A box throughout the session, and we will pick them up at the end. So without further ado, with huge thanks to the speakers for agreeing to join us today, I'll hand over to Simeon.
Thanks very much, Louisa. And it's a real pleasure to be on this panel today, talking about such an important topic, media plurality in an online world. In the 15 minutes that I've got available to me, I wanted to do four things really. Briefly summarize how media plurality regulation works in the UK. Secondly, describe what we mean by digital intermediaries and give a sense of how important they are in the UK in terms of online news consumption. And thirdly, set out some of the key hypotheses that have been advanced in relation to the potential impact these intermediaries may have on media plurality. And finally, focus on some of the gaps in our evidence base and how we might fill them. So on the first topic, as Louisa said, I mean, Ofcom has defined media plurality as ensuring a diversity in the viewpoints that are available and consumed, and preventing any one media owner or voice having too much influence over public opinion. And in that sense, media plurality is not a goal in itself, but means to an end, that end being informed citizens and preventing undue influence over the democratic process, both of which are, of course, essential to a well-functioning democratic society. So it's difficult for us for me to imagine us talking about a more important topic today. As Louisa referred to, Ofcom has a number of functions that relate to media plurality currently. It has a role in relation to mergers that involve a broadcaster or a newspaper. Those mergers may be subject to a public interest test, and if that is the case, then Ofcom advises the Secretary of State on whether the merger can be expected to operate against the public interest. Secondly, there are a set of rules and regulations in place as to who can own TV and radio services, and Ofcom has a duty to review those rules every 3 years and provide advice to the Secretary of State on any necessary changes. And we just published our report in that respect in November of last year. And Ofcom also has a range of other functions which, while not exclusively orientated towards media plurality, serve to further its aims. And those include, for example, the licensing regime for broadcasters and the broadcasting code, which among other things require broadcasters to ensure that news is reported with due accuracy and presented with due impartiality. Now, in the November publication that I mentioned, we did note that there were potential gaps in the regulatory regime, particularly as it relates to online news. Those gaps relate to a number of areas. So the role of online intermediaries and the algorithms that they control, which have an influence over the prominence that are given to different news sources and stories, the transparency or lack of transparency over which those algorithms operate, and the fact that consumers do not always critically engage with the accuracy and partiality of news online. We are currently undertaking work to, I guess, assess the nature of these concerns and the impact that they might have on media plurality. And that is why this discussion today is a very timely one. So on to the first main question, which is what is the role of these online intermediaries and how important are they? I think just as a piece of context, it's worth noting that digitization has led to a huge shift in the costs of and importance of different news functions online. So in terms of the production of news content, the costs of these have fallen for many forms of news content, but not all. So for example, investigative journalism is still pretty expensive, but other types of news content, such as opinion pieces, less expensive. And the distribution of content, the costs of this have collapsed to near zero. And in terms of the curation of news into packages, so in the old world, the creation of a physical newspaper or a piece of television broadcast, this curation can now be personalized through user data. And when you combine all of those different factors, there's a huge increase in the number of potential news suppliers. And that means that news distribution networks, as they were in the old world, are no longer the key limiting factor. Rather, gaining consumer attention is the key determinant of success for a news creator. And online intermediaries have a key role in this space. They drive consumer attention through the use of algorithms. Those might be search algorithms or personalized curation of news feeds. They help with monetization, in particularly through offering advertising intermediation services. And they collect and interpret user data to support both these functions of driving consumer attention and monetization. We think it's helpful to identify three broad types of intermediary. The first of these is search, obviously Google being very big in this space and Bing also. So search involves finding a relevant news content in response to a user query. In the case of search, the news content is typically consumed on the creator's website rather than on the search website. You have aggregators like Apple News, which combine news from different creators into a personalized news service. The content's typically consumed on the aggregator. And you have social media, which again involves algorithmic curation, which users can share and comment on news within their personal networks. Again, the news typically consumed on the platform. And the important distinction I wanted to make is actually between search on the one hand and aggregators and social media on the other hand. And that is because with search, the curation happens in response to a user stimulus. So I input a search query and I get a set of results. In contrast, with aggregators and social media, there is a need proactively to curate content based on the interests and history of the users. In other words, to use personal data. That imperative to use personal data to curate content is not there with search. And to cut to the chase, the point I want to pick up later, I think that speaks to largely potentially quite important different impacts between search on the one hand and aggregators and social media, on the other hand, in terms of their impact on media plurality. So some facts and figures. How important is online news consumption in the UK? Well, we have a patchwork of evidence, but in the UK, we tend to use something called the News Consumption Survey, which is a really great source of information, holistic information about where people get their news. And you can see from this chart, which is from the most recent survey in 2021, that 73% of us got our news from the internet. That is up very considerably from 32% in 2013. It's second only to television. So I think the big picture story there is the internet is obviously very important and increasing in importance. And another important fact I wanted to highlight is that 11% of us use exclusively the internet to get news. You compare that with, for example, print newspapers, where apparently none of us exclusively use print newspapers anymore to get our news. So really some very contrasting results there. Just to do a bit of a deep dive in social media before I move on, roughly half of us said that we use some form of social media for news. Respondents were also asked to list their most important source of individual news, and Facebook came fourth on that list behind the BBC Online, BBC Television and ITV. And within social media, I think there's some evidence from the survey that algorithmic curation is a particularly important source of news. So if you look, this chart shows how news is accessed via social media in 2021. And the top category there is seeing news stories that are trending. So that was much more important as a source of news than, for example, actively following journalists or news organizations. So the third topic I wanted to discuss, and perhaps the main meat of the discussion, is how might digital intermediaries be affecting media plurality? I'm going to talk through three different hypotheses. Now, these are hypotheses and concerns that have been aired in the literature, and I'm going to discuss some of the publicly available evidence in relation to them. I should say Ofcom has not reached a conclusion on any of these issues. Indeed, we will be doing further work to inform our thinking. So this is really just a summary of what's out there in the public domain. So the first hypothesis I wanted to look at is the impact of online intermediaries on financial sustainability. It is undoubtedly the case that news publishers have a number of key commercial relationships with online intermediaries, particularly Google and Facebook. So they rely on them to host news content and drive traffic to their websites. In the digital advertising study that Louisa mentioned I led at the CMA, we found that Google and Facebook between them accounted for about 40% of the news traffic that went to news websites. They rely on them to sell digital advertising online. Google obviously has a very important role to play here. Google has a very high market share in all of the key stages of advertising intermediation, in particular this thing called the publisher ad server segment. Publisher ad server is basically the piece of kit that determines which ad is going to be served on a piece of inventory, what price is going to be paid. And Google has over 90% of the publisher ad server segment. But while relying on these online intermediaries, news organizations also have to compete with them for user attention and advertising. And it's relevant here that Facebook takes over 50% of display advertising in the UK. So they're very, very dependent on these online intermediaries. And I think it's well known that news publishers have raised a number of concerns about these relationships. These concerns relate to a lack of transparency in the use of algorithms. And when you consider that those algorithms can have big and unpredictable effects on traffic, that's an understandable concern. They relate to unequal access to user data. So platforms can access data on publishers' users and simultaneously restrict publishers' access to this data. And they relate to high fees for intermediation. So we calculated in the market study that Google takes about 30% of all open display advertising revenues for its intermediation services. And they also finally relate to inadequate remuneration for the use of content. It is certainly true that in recent years, the revenues and profitability of UK news publishers have declined, and that in itself creates concerns for media plurality. But we should mention that there are other potential explanations for these financial concerns that are associated with the broader digital economy rather than the specific role of online intermediaries. And that includes, for example, the loss of print broadcast revenue and the personalization of advertising and commoditization of audience data, which undermines the extent to which a prestigious news organization is able to command a premium for advertising. Ofcom and the CMA have been commissioned to do some work looking into these relationships, and will explore some of these issues in more detail. So the second concern relates to the impact of online intermediaries on the diversity of news sources and the risks of echo chambers. And the concern here, to put it succinctly, is that curation algorithms prioritize news content that accords with users' prior beliefs, leading to echo chambers in which inconvenient facts and opinions are filtered out. Now, what does the evidence show on this? Well, first off, observational studies tend to show, on the contrary, that intermediated news consumption leads to citizens accessing a greater number of news sources than direct access. In other words, it's not consistent with the echo chambers hypothesis, and there are various sources of evidence for this. So, for example, the news consumption survey that I mentioned shows that those of us who use the internet and online, access news online, engage with a greater number of news sources than those of us who use TV or print media. And there is a whole host of passive tracking evidence online that supports this contention as well. And Rasmus is going to be talking about some of that evidence in the UK, so I won't steal his thunder. So there's that piece of evidence. However, there is also evidence, in particular trial evidence from RCTs, that shows, and a particular study I'm thinking about is focusing on Facebook. It's from Levy in 2021. That found that Facebook's algorithm is less likely to supply individuals with posts from counter-attitudinal outlets, even if those individuals subscribe to them. The implication being that social media algorithms may limit exposure to counter-attitudinal news. So I think there's a bit of mixed evidence there on the high-level question. But the point I wanted to make is that none of the studies, at least none of the studies that I'm aware of, look at plurality in terms of news content. They tend to focus on diversity of news at the outlet level. And I think this is quite a major gap. It's understandable because it's very difficult to look at plurality in terms of the underlying content of the news. But I think when most people have a concern about echo chambers, it really is at that content level. So it seems to me that's quite an important gap that we should try to fill. And the final and third concern relates to polarization. And here the hypothesis is that algorithms might give more prominence to more controversial or polarizing news because polarizing content drives engagement. Now, the published evidence finds some support, again focusing on Facebook, for Facebook use leading to increased polarization. The Levy study that I already mentioned, and a study by Alcott and others in 2020, which found that deactivating Facebook for 4 weeks decreases ideological polarization. So I think the evidence has taken us forward in our understanding, but there are lots of things that are still not clear. For example, does this sort of conclusion apply to other platforms? I think it's really interesting that if you look at the Levy piece, it found that online search led to the least polarized views compared to both social media use and direct use of news. And I think that speaks to a point I alluded to earlier, which is there are really important distinctions to be made within online intermediation. And in particular, one might expect very different outcomes in relation to the impact of search compared to social media. And the second gap really is that the precise mechanisms through which polarization may be increased, e.g. by amplifying aspects of user choice or through algorithmic design, are not yet clear to us. And this brings me on to my final slide, really, which is, what are the gaps in the evidence base and how might we fill them? And I have to say, having come to this specific topic relatively recently, I think we are still in the foothills of this area, and there is a long way to go to understand these issues fully. And the gaps relates to the basic issues of measurement. So, for example, I mentioned we use the news consumption survey extensively in the UK, but there are some issues with using surveys. Obviously, people's recall is not infallible, and so we might want to find ways of combining tracking, measurement, passive tracking, and survey approaches. Within passive tracking, I think there are still areas which are a bit of a black box. So for example, if you use most passive tracking software, you won't really be able to distinguish what people are doing on Facebook, whether they are consuming news or other material. That's an area to address. I think we need to look broadly at whether the results that have been found, generally in relation to the US and generally in relation to Facebook, can be extended to other geographies, particularly the UK and other platforms. I think we need a much more granular understanding of causality of a sort that you can get through either trial approaches or indeed understanding the algorithms and scrutinizing the algorithms in detail. And I know that Raman is doing some fascinating work with the Twitter team there, which I'll look forward to hearing about later. And I think then there's that final point, which is that we tend to assess plurality and diversity according to the source of the news. I think we need to do more work looking at the specific content of news articles to assess this hypothesis properly. So really, I wanted to leave it there. We are producing a new publication later in this year, exploring some of these issues, and we will be drawing on public research and carrying out our own research to inform this. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simeon. Andrea.
Thank you very much, Louisa. I hope everybody can hear me. I think this is a great session, and I'm really thankful for being part of it. And I think Simeon said, did a great job summarizing what we know, what the main issues are, and also I like that he left off by saying that there is a lot here that we don't know. We have huge gaps in our knowledge. And in particular, you were talking about sources versus content. So I think our gap is toward the end. So if we think of the news process as starting with the production of news, then this news is distributed, then it is consumed, and then it is absorbed. And absorption leads to information. I think we know a lot about production. We have some information about distribution and consumption, but we know very little about what that news does to people. And ultimately, if we think about it, this is what we care about, because we want our citizens to be informed and to make electoral choices, political choices that are based on information. So, and I don't need to remind this audience that there is a lot of evidence for that. There is a lot of evidence that more informed citizens make better decisions, and they hold their politicians accountable, and then they get better political outcomes. I think the recent debate has focused on polarization and fake news. It has mostly used evidence from the supply of fake news, and it has gone to thinking about the idea of parallel universes. So I think one famous quote comes from Obama. One of the biggest challenges that we have to our democracy is the degree to which we don't share a common baseline of facts. We are operating in completely different information universes. Notice that this is not a statement about the production, distribution, or consumption of news. It's a statement about absorption. It's a statement about what we know and what we believe. And this, at least in the US, has led to very extreme policy proposals by important constitutional scholars, including rethinking the First Amendment. So the evidence, as I was mentioning, is mainly about the production part. There is very limited evidence about the effect of all this on information. And a lot of these, what the limited evidence we have is about fake stories. Do we believe fake stories? Ultimately, the key question is, can we distinguish real from fake, and do we know real stories? So what we are what we've been trying to do, and it's very much work in progress. There's a paper, there's a discussion paper that is available online, and I'm going to try to talk about this, but it's very much work in progress, is to try and understand a little bit more about absorption, try to get a broader view of how informed are people about recent political events, and you know how accurate Obama's statement is. And in doing this, I think we discover one important phenomenon, or maybe we rediscover it because it was something that people thought a lot about maybe 20 years ago, which is information inequality. So let me tell you what we do, and then I'll discuss the sort of the three main results we get out of this. So we want to talk about absorption. We want to talk about how informed citizens are about recent political events. There's a huge challenge here, which is what is a recent important political event. And the existing literature is in our view problematic, because when they ask these questions, they ask them, the researchers select these questions, and we don't know according to what criteria they select them. So it's very difficult to interpret, and it's very difficult to replicate. And of course, depending on what question you ask, you can get that many people know it, very few people know it, left-wing people know it, right-wing people know it. So our viewpoint here is that you need some discipline, and the discipline comes from taking this protocol away from the researcher and making it very explicit. It's always going to be a subjective view, but it has to be explicit so that we can critique it and replicate it. So what we do is we take the subjective view of mainstream journalists. Unfortunately, this work is about the US, so what it means for the UK context is very difficult to say. And what we do very briefly is we take all the main stories about US domestic policy in a month, and we ask a panel of professional mainstream journalists to identify what, in their subjective views, are the three most important stories of the month. Again, I want to stress that this is subjective. This is a subjective view of mainstream journalism, and so we're going to measure the informational distance between US mainstream journalists and the population overall. We're gonna we have a panel of 1,000 US voters every month. We do it for 8 months. We actually have 11 months altogether. And the way we play this game is we put 3 real stories and 3 fake stories, and we pay people to recognize the real stories. The fake stories are in 2 versions. We have real fake stories. We take the 3 most circulated fake stories according to Snopes.com, and we do another version with synthetic fake stories that are there to maximize plausibility. So this is an example of what you get. You just have 60 minutes, you get $1 for every correct answer. And so 60 minutes, 60 seconds. So you don't have enough time to Google it. And these are 6 stories. They're randomly listed, and you have to find the 3 real ones. This was in April 2020, if I recall correctly. So let me give you sort of 3. There's a lot of results here. There's a lot of way you can cut the data. There is a lot of way you can extend this, and we're extending it in various directions. Let me give you sort of 3 broad results that seem to come out of this. I'm skipping a lot of passages here. Once you get this data, you have to analyze it through a model, because if you offer $1 to someone to choose a real story and they don't know, they're going to randomize. They're going to rule out stuff that they know. And so you need a model to think about that. The outcome of the model is as follows. If you think about our subjects, you can look at, let's begin by looking at the first true story of the month and ask ourselves, what percentage of our subjects choose our first story, our most important story of the month confidently. This comes out of the model, and it means they're willing to bet $3 of their own against $1 on that story. So they put at least a 75% probability on it. That percentage is 59%. So according to our data, 59% of Americans are pretty confident in recognizing the most important story of the month. 3% are pretty confident in recognizing it as false. And then there's this huge chunk of people, 39%, who just don't know. They're tossing a coin, basically. If you look at the second story of the month, the percentages move, so fewer people recognize it confidently. If you look at the third story, the percentages move too. If you look at the percentage of people who recognize a false story confidently as false, that's 45%. 11% recognize it as confidently true. And then you have this big chunk of people who just don't know. So a big message here is that, yes, there is fake news. There are people who believe fake news. There are people who don't believe the truth, but there is this big chunk of people who just don't know. They're just uninformed. This is, in a sense, an obvious result, but I think it puts the polarization debate in a different light. To get a benchmark, are Americans particularly uninformed about politics? We run the same test with the same protocol, the same format on sports and entertainment, and we get very similar figures. So it's difficult to argue that there's a death of truth in America. It's easier to argue that there's inequality. There's a 59% of people who are kind of with it, and a 40% who are not. And I'm going to tell you two more facts about it. So the first one is the parallel universe stories. Is it true that certain stories are only known by Democrats, certain stories are only known by Republicans? Is it true, as Obama said, that we live in parallel universes? And here we have a lot of data. We have 1,000 people per month. And so we do find this effect. We find it very clearly. So if a story is strongly pro-Republican, 46% of Republicans will believe it confidently. Only 43% of Democrats will believe it confidently. The percentages are reversed if the story is strongly pro-Democrat. So these parallel universes do exist, but I want you to see the order of magnitude. It is about 3%. So it's important. I'm not saying this is not important, but I want you to compare it with the next fact that we find. The next fact that we find is inequalities across socioeconomic groups. And if you take if you just do this super raw exercise where you divide people according to age, whether they're above or below 47, whether they're men or women, whether they're white or minority, or whether their income is above or below $6,000, you see that the most informed group, which is wealthy old white men, is 53% more likely to hold correct beliefs than young minority poor women. You see the magnitude order is 10 times the parallel universe magnitude order. And so the last slide I'm gonna show you is a slide where you try to disentangle that. And I wanna stress there's nothing causal here. We're just trying to account for what explains the information of US voters. And the main factors are demographic factors. Age, older people seem to be much more informed. Wealth, education, whether you're a man, whether you're not a minority, all these factors are very strong. They're extremely strong. One thing you can do is to try and see if there's anything you can do to demolish these factors, and that will take us to plurality. So you add whether they're Democrat or Republican, that has no effect. So it's not true that Democrats are more or less informed than Republicans on average. Now, once you start adding information about media consumption, you get something. The total time they spend on media, that is a good predictor of how informed you are, and in general, how interested you are in news. Plurality per se doesn't seem to, it's not significant. The sign is in the right direction, but it's not significant. And but I want to stress that this is, I think, an area where so much more research needs to be done to map consumption into absorption. So the general picture we get, and I'm gonna conclude here, is that if we look at knowledge, news knowledge in the US, we see the parallel universes, but we see the old style information inequality as being an order of magnitude greater. We try to probe that by looking at whether, so how do we interpret that? It feels like a large proportion of Americans are simply disengaged with the news. They're not getting much out of the news. This is a distance between those segments of the population and mainstream journalism. So to me, it seems that one of the key questions in terms of thinking about policy has to do with trying to think how we can bridge that inequality gap and reduce that informational distance between the young, women, minorities, and the poor with mainstream information. My sense is that mainstream journalism has to ask itself questions about what they report on and how they report on. And I think public sector broadcasting should be at the forefront of this thinking. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Andrea. We're going to hear from Roman next.
Thank you. Let's see if my share screen will work. Okay, perfect. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we are.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you so much for the previous presenters. I apologize. My camera seems to be malfunctioning today. I want to talk a bit about the applied work we've been doing at Twitter to understand exactly the kind of phenomena that the previous panelists, as well as the following panelists, Asmus, will be talking about as well. And I want to point to some research that my team has done on social media and algorithmic amplification. So I want to start off by defining what algorithmic amplification is. So we have a paper from last year that demonstrates evidence that during April through August of 2020, Twitter's home timeline amplified center-right politicians' contents, in other words, their tweets, compared to the reverse chronological algorithm. So that is a very important construct. I think I just want to be very careful with my words and how I explain the phenomenon, because it has often come to mean, oh, Twitter is amplifying far-right content, which is untrue, or so either misunderstanding who the audience is that is being amplified. In this case, it is center-right politicians from multiple countries, and not center-right or right-wing content writ large. So this is not the average Twitter user. This is politicians who are self-defined, as per their political party. And second is that the time frame, April through August of 2020, which will actually play a very important role in understanding, why we may be seeing this phenomenon. So in our blog post, I made sure to mention that we've identified the what, and now we have to figure out the why. So we do have, this evidence that shows that during this time period, as I mentioned, compared to our reverse chronological algorithm, the Twitter's home timeline amplified center-right politicians' content. I also do want to make a little asterisk clarification here as well, because I've seen this come up again lately, and it comes up periodically. There does seem to be this misconception that that there is a possibility of a non-algorithmic version of social media, and there simply is not. So reverse chronological is an algorithm. The most simply defined algorithm is simply a set of rules, and in this case, to define what content you shall see. So it is literally impossible to see every piece of content that you could possibly see on Twitter. There has to be some sorting mechanism. Now, I think, the nuanced conversation that we are having here, and maybe, the narrative gets a bit oversimplified to say, quote, no algorithm, is, are we talking about machine learning algorithms? What should they include? And that's the kind of conversation that I hope to be having. And I think that the output of this research demonstrates exactly why we need to have that conversation, as well as what are the implications and what are the tricky considerations that need to be in place. So this ends up being a case study example of how we might approach understanding whether it's regulating, reconstructing, or understanding a public approach to algorithmic amplification. So one thing I do want to mention is that social media algorithms are a socio-technical system. Certainly, this is not to critique any academics that do this work or the people who do this work. I fall into that language myself, or we'll say the algorithm does X, right? So, first let's define socio-technical, and social media algorithms are the perfect example of a socio-technical system. It is an iterative system whereby human input influences algorithmic output. And this is incredibly important when we're talking about political content. As some of the other folks have pointed out, people like reading certain kinds of media. At what point do we step in and say, well, you should not be reading X or reading Y, and at what point is that inappropriate? That is a social problem. That is a socio part of the socio-technical system. The technical specifications could, I don't want to oversimplify how easy it is to build those, but it is much easier to build in the safeguards once we have decided what the safeguards are. So the hard problem to tackle here is that in a truly socio-technical system, what is parity? So in this case, it would be very simply defined as a reverse chronological algorithm should not have a different amplification than any sort of algorithmic intervention. Maybe, maybe not. Right? Because in this case, it could be the algorithm operating as expected. In other words, being responsive to what people want to see. More on that in a following slide. But the third question to think about is how should parity be enforced? Or, whatever parity is. Or a better question is, who should be responsible for enforcing it? Is this social media companies? In which case, what is the accountability mechanism? How do we, quote, prove that, indeed, the parity that whoever has decided is the best output is actually what is happening? Again, just the sheer volume and complexity of these systems means that it is very hard for the average person to understand what the systemic output writ large is. And to talk to that a little bit, and again, this is also in our blog post, where there is not a Twitter algorithm, contrary to what Elon Musk may think. There is not a single algorithm that dominates your entire home timeline. If one way to imagine it is you have, a lot of people look at Twitter on their smartphones. If you imagine how small the screen of your smartphone is, you have hundreds of millions of pieces of content that all fight for that tiny bit of real estate. So maybe 4 things can fit on that screen. And among those 4 things could be a tweet from someone you know, a retweet, advertising, it could be a topic, something we are suggesting to you. And all of those are very, very separate models, and they all sort of interact in this one experience. So, tearing apart why a phenomenon is happening is very, very different from tearing apart what the phenomenon is. And then that also begs the question of how should parity be enforced and who should enforce it? How do we check the system? How do we report this output to say, correct, yes, we have agreed upon what the world ought to look like, and we can prove that we are doing it. But to go back to the topic of the slide, social media algorithms are a socio-technical system. They are a function of human input and algorithmic output. So the work we are doing now is to actually appreciate algorithmic amplification, not as an inherent static property of a system, but as a current state relative to the socio-technical system. So to explain that in less complex terms, what if algorithmic amplification is just a value and we track it over time? And if we take a step back, yes, our case study was in political parties because that's a very salient issue, but one could theoretically take any mutually exclusive groups and compare how they are amplified per this very specific construct, which is Twitter's home timeline algorithmic system versus a reverse chronological algorithm. So that starts to lend itself to some really fascinating, from a research nerd perspective, really, really fascinating work we could be doing, and also a very different way of understanding it and why, right? So I am a recovering economist. I am also a quantitative social scientist, so I get very excited to think about algorithmic amplification as a time series. So our initial review, this is not research we've yet published, shows that this is promising. In other words, this value does fluctuate over time. In the very beginning, I asked you to remember that the study was done inclusive of April through August of 2020. Now, when we think about that, why is that important as a time series? Well, there was kind of a lot going on at that time related to political issues and especially related to center-right issues. From my US perspective, Donald Trump was still president and we had an election coming up. For sure, no matter where you lay on the political spectrum, center-right political issues and possibly far-right political issues was something you were thinking about, talking about, reading, retweeting, etc. So why is it important and helpful to understand algorithmic amplification as a time series? So first, it treats amplification as a systemic property subject to both algorithmic and human impact. In other words, there are two reasons why amplification could be happening. It could be some combination of one, this idea of algorithmic bias. In other words, this model is somehow picking up things that it is not being input, which we know can happen, right, via proxy variables. In other words, these models are picking up who is a center-right politician and somehow through an artifact of proxy variables, amplifying their content. If that is algorithmic bias in that sense, then that is an intervention that is different from understanding it as a product of human impact. So in other words, during this time frame, as I mentioned, lots of people were talking about center-right issues. People were talking about far-right issues, no matter where you lay on the spectrum. So this leads to much, much more complex questions. Back to my second slide, right? What is equal in this case? If people are saying we want to read X, who is the body that arbitrates? Well, this is what you ought to be reading. This is a very eat your vegetables moment, right? Eat your vegetables, read diverse content, don't retweet that person who I have decided or some body has decided is an outlier or spreading false information. And thank you for the previous talk that discussed the complexity of even understanding what a fact is and what truth is. Because in reality, what we largely see on Twitter is not as easy as fake news. It is often distracting disinformation. So it is something that is truthful, that is actually happening, but is serving as a distraction mechanism from something else that is going on. In other words, I could be setting fire to the house over here, but I could be pointing at the house across the street and saying, look at that ugly car, right? And in other words, you would not be paying attention to the fact the house is on fire. How do you handle that kind of situation? So it's very, very unclear who would be the one to say, well, this is actually the most salient thing you should be talking about. Second, so once we've done that, the algorithmic bias aspect of it and the human impact bias of it, leads to very, very different questions and very different investigations and also very, very different interventions. Second is, algorithmic amplification as a time series allows us to make some assumptions, right? In other words, there is theoretically a normal function for what this looks like. And that means we can identify things like outliers, precipitating events, and possibly even leading, lagging, and coincident indicators. Now, the third is a bit of a stretch, but as I mentioned, I'm a recovering economist. I used to work for the Conference Board and calculate economic indicators. And it is very fascinating to think that there may be certain things that are a trigger to say, hey, we might be reaching an amplification event, an outlier amplification event. And then Twitter can be proactive in terms of understanding where amplification could be coming from, and also in that sense, dissecting it into malicious content, in other words, bots, malware, et cetera, versus actual people tweeting and retweeting content, even if misguided, that is legitimate. And I'll give you a perfect example. TechFog in India, served to hijack Twitter the Twitter trending aspect of the platform in order to amplify certain kinds of content, right? So that leads to I suppose one would say, a non-virtuous cycle whereby things are on trending, people are clicking. So there's a combination of malicious behavior as well as well-intentioned but misguided behavior. But again, we are able to do that if we can take this event and dissect it into component parts. So again, understanding one, how much of it could be an artifact of the model itself. Two, how much of this is human impact, and then further dissecting that human impact into, people who are genuinely talking about the event, people who are maybe intentionally or unintentionally distracting from other conversations, and then also malicious abusers who may be amplifying it to lead the first and the second, to lead to this outcome of algorithmic amplification. So complex, yes. Years of work ahead, absolutely. But frankly, in my opinion, very, very fascinating. So what's next? As I have been emphasizing, it is very critical to appreciate and differentiate algorithmic amplification's component parts. The second, which, again, as a social scientist, I find very fascinating, is how do you address algorithmic bias versus what I've been calling the zeitgeist, right? Like the thing we are talking about at the moment. And who decides what is an appropriate amount of amplification? Is there an appropriate amount of amplification? And who should enforce and how? And my personal belief is this is a question that is answered beyond Twitter. I would be, I do not think any single person knows the answer to this question. I do not think any single body should have the ability to unilaterally make decisions on this. But these are the kinds of questions that we're hoping to and we're excited to spark because of the research that we're doing. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Roman. And finally, we get to Rasmus. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and I'll join everybody else in thanking Ofcom for organizing this panel. And just to say it's an absolute pleasure to be part of the group today, and that I want to thank Rumen in particular for being part of a conversation like this. I think it's quite conspicuous how often it's Twitter who's willing to share more about their work, not only data with scientists, but also to discuss in public how the platform actually operates, while many of your much larger competitors are conspicuously absent from conversations like this. So Ofcom asked me to talk about some of our work at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism on what we have found empirically in terms of what platforms mean for news media plurality in the UK, where Ofcom, of course, is based, and where we are based too, though much of our work is global. The work that I'll present today is just a little bit of context, and then a set of particular studies that I worked on with my colleague, Dr. Richard Fletcher from the Reuters Institute, and our former colleague, Antonis Kalogeropoulos, who is currently at the University of Liverpool. So a bit of context first. As Simeon made clear, we are moving towards an increasingly digital, mobile, and platform-dominated media environment. In high-income democracies, more than half of people's media use by now is digital. More than half of that media use is mobile first, and about half that time is spent with a few large platforms that in turn provide people access to all sorts of different products and services and types of content. When we look at the legacy media, the backdrop of this is a long-term structural decline, in particular in print, but also stagnation in television viewing and rapidly aging audiences. So in the United States, for example, print circulation per capita has been in nonstop decline for more than half a century. And newspapers' share of the total advertising market similarly has been in nonstop decline for more than half a century, even as digital media has become more important and as people increasingly access and find news in many different ways online. But when asked to identify their main way of accessing news online, increasingly in many countries point to social media and search, and aggregators to a lesser extent. The figures I'm showing here are just average numbers across the 46 markets covered in the Reuters Institute Digital News Report, an online survey we do every year of internet news users across the globe, where in 2021, of all the different ways in which respondents say they access news online, just 25% globally say that going direct to a news site or app is their main way of accessing news online. And a much larger share, a clear majority, rely on various forms of algorithmic selection through social media search and aggregators in combination, well over half. And of course, in particular for the younger respondents, the under 35s, just 18% say that going direct to a news site or app is their main way of getting news, and many more rely on social in particular. As Simeon also mentioned, and I think this is very important to understand the plurality concerns, of course, as audience attention has migrated to digital and in turn to a few big platforms, so as advertising, advertisers are not philanthropists, they're not in the business of supporting news, they're in the business of shipping product and improving their brands. And they go where they believe they can get that attention, where they can get it cheaply at scale and in targeted fashions. And Google and Facebook are the most visible winners of that competition for advertising in the Western world. But of course, when you look at data for an e-marketer, for example, 9 out of the 10 largest sellers of digital advertising are platform companies. And the final one is a telco. So it's largely tech companies that are winning the battle, not just for attention, but also for advertising. If that's the context with implications for, what are the implications then for the supply of news? Well, I mean, I think it means that we are seeing the end of offline revenues subsidizing the production of digital journalism. The World Association of News Media, what was quaintly known as newspapers, estimates about 90% of newspaper revenues globally still come from print. Broadcasters are heavily reliant on their offline revenues. Even after more than 20 years, many newspapers' digital operations, especially for local titles, are not profitable on their own, but only because they have access to content that's produced for the print product. And many commercial broadcasters not even really trying to make a profit from digital news, which is just a side product of the fact that they have news for their offline operations and not really something they try very hard to monetize. And obviously this cannot go on indefinitely as print newspaper circulation and advertising continues its structural decline inexorably, as television audiences stagnate and grow older and older, and over time will grow less lucrative. These offline subsidies are going to shrivel up. So there is already a supply side challenge, and a supply side challenge that will be especially pronounced for local news and for those types of news that's always been hardest to provide on the market basis, namely news that's oriented towards people who are poor, people who are marginalized, people who are underprivileged in different ways around racial, ethnic, or religious lines, or for that matter, in terms of geography. If that's the supply side, which is clearly challenged by many developments, but also accentuated by the rise of platforms and the way in which we as users have flocked to them in terms of how we spend our time online. What are the consequences then for individual news repertoires on the demand side and for aggregate news use on the demand side? What we've done is that we've used a passive tracking approach where we worked with YouGov's Pulse panel to track desktop and laptop news use in the UK. At the time of the study, more than 13,000 panelists and almost 7,000 active users. Because the participants provide demographic data, YouGov is able to assemble a nationally representative panel in terms of age, gender, and region here in the UK. So it's internet users only, and of course there are some unknown biases in terms of who will let their behavior be tracked, but it's broadly representative in terms of the participants themselves. We collected data from middle of March to middle of April for 4 weeks in 2017. Already here, contextually, I should say that less than half of the active users of YouGov's Pulse panel accessed any of 21 major UK news sites in these 4 weeks. And in total, we tracked about 170,000 clicks over these 4 weeks. So for those who are good at math, this is basically about 2 clicks a day on average. And of course, with a very sort of uneven distribution, actually, many participants read only maybe 1 article online a day, and many of them, of course, less than that on average. What do we find then? I will show the diversity in terms of individual end users' online news diet across different ways of accessing online news. The measure I'm using here is something called Simpson's D, which is a classic measure of content diversity in media communication research, which is gives a score from 0 to 1 at the level of the brands of the individual articles, individual people we tracked accessed in this period. And the score essentially is the probability that 2 articles from the total number of articles that a person consumed, depending on a particular kind of access type, are from the same outlet. This gives us a diversity score from 0, very low, to 1, the highest possible level of diversity. The political diversity is a score we calculated because, of course, as several previous speakers have pointed out, more content is not necessarily more diverse in a more substantial sense. It is just more of the same, if you see what I mean, more similarly aligned sources. So to get at this, we categorize the 21 UK news outlets that we cover into outlets that, on the basis of the audience composition, are seen as being in the political center, the BBC, but also titles such as Metro or the Evening Standard. Outlets that are seen as being politically on the right, based on their audience composition. These are both upmarket titles such as The Telegraph and more popular titles such as The Sun or The Mail, as well as outlets that are politically on the left. So upmarket titles such as The Guardian, or more popular titles such as The Mirror. And similarly, we can then calculate a Simpson's D in terms of how balanced a individual's consumption is from outlets depending on the sort of right, center, and left categorization. What are the results then by different types of access? Well, let's start with direct access. Essentially, what we find in our analysis is that the more times a participant in a tracking study access news by going directly to a news site, overall, the less diverse and the less politically diverse their overall consumption is. So the majority of additional direct accesses is more of the same, and often more of the same from a single favorite brand. And as you can see from the numbers of one of the axes here, the numbers can get quite high. I mean, some people are very avid consumers of a single or a few brands. So you get hundreds or even over 1,000 visits in the course of the 4 weeks to a single site when it comes to direct access. And as said, more direct access drives less diversity and less political diversity in the overall media repertoire of an individual. What about different forms of platform intermediation then? Facebook first, we find that the more frequently a panelist accessed news from Facebook and then onto a news URL, the more diverse their overall media diet was in terms of the number of different brands they accessed in the course of the month, but also the greater diversity in terms of political variation across the sort of right, center, and the left. So more accesses to news via Facebook, greater diversity, and greater political diversity. And actually, we find the same for search, though, as Simeon suggested, even more strongly. So people don't actually have to rely that much on search before it really begins to drive much, much greater levels of diversity in terms of both the number of different brands they access, but also the balance across the political spectrum. So search, particularly strong relationship there with the frequency of relying on search, and then the diversity and political diversity of individuals' news repertoire. Twitter, again, very similar pattern to Facebook. More reliance on Twitter drives greater diversity and greater diversity politically. And finally, the same for Google News as an aggregator. Again, very similar pattern to that seen for Facebook and for Twitter. Greater reliance on the Google News aggregator directly related to greater diversity and greater political diversity in terms of the news stories that people access. So the top line there at the individual level is that greater reliance on going directly of your own volition to a news site or an app is generally less diversity and less political diversity in people's news consumption, whereas reliance on different forms of aggregators, social media and search, in particular search, is related with greater diversity. And in the paper, we replicate the findings for robustness with something called Shannon's H, which I won't go through here, but basically find the same patterns using a different metric for diversity. This is at the individual level. So generally, individuals' news diets become more diverse if they rely on platforms than if they only go direct. What about the overall aggregate level of demand then? Here we use the HHI, a commonly used indicator of concentration. Instead of using market share in terms of revenue, we use a market share here in terms of attention, so the number of clicks, and we use first visits only, since these are the decisive ones in terms of online traffic, where next clicks are often to the same brand. So this is about discovery and not the whole data set. So about 60,000 of the clicks we analyze. For benchmarks, I provide here the HHI score for weekday print newspaper circulation in 2017, just above the CMA level of concentrated markets. Television viewing the same year, also concentrated more so than print newspaper circulation. And then the overall concentration of all the clicks in our online passive tracking data set, so above the CMA level for concentrated markets. But if we break this down then by means of access, what levels of concentration of attention do we then get? I mean, in the sense, this is intuitive because it's the reverse of what we see at the individual level. At the aggregate level too, we find that Twitter levels of concentration are concentrated by CMA levels, but not as high as television viewing, for example. Search about the same score, HHI-wise, in terms of concentration. Google News as an aggregator, again, about the same level of concentration as for weekday print newspaper circulation. And then Facebook, slightly lower with a greater distribution of the clicks from Facebook in terms of the share that different brands get of the referrals from Facebook. And then finally, of course, the kicker is that direct traffic is very, very highly concentrated in the UK with an HHI of well over 3,000, driven primarily by the fact that just three outlets, the BBC, the Mail Online, and the Guardian, account for the majority of all the direct clicks in the data set. So very, very high levels of concentration of attention through direct discovery, and a still concentrated markets for attention in terms of aggregator search and most social, though slightly less over Facebook, but much lower than that for direct discovery, and actually not so different from that we see in print newspaper circulation. So to wrap up very quickly, what are the takeaways here? First of all, if we think about platforms' impact on media plurality, it's clear that as attention and advertising is moving to digital, mobile, and platform media, there are challenges to traditional news businesses. And that means that the supply of news will change with a few winners, often upmarket national titles, and many losers. And I think there are particularly important issues here around local and around news from marginalized and underprivileged communities, which has always been hard to provide on a commercial basis, but is really challenged now, even as it's also the case of more voices can be heard online than ever before and often are being expressed in different ways. At the same time, we also find that increasing reliance on platforms is clearly linked with greater diversity in individuals' news use, and that in the aggregate, news discovery via platforms is much less concentrated than direct discovery. So quite mixed findings, real challenges to supply on the one hand, but when we look at the demand side, it seems to be the case that not only that people who rely on platforms demonstrably have more diverse news diets than those who rely more on direct discovery, but also that platforms, even as they capture and concentrate attention upon themselves, actually contribute to more diversity in terms of the aggregate level of attention to news online than direct discovery. With that, I will stop sharing. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Rasmus. And that takes us to our Q&A sessions. We've had a few questions from the audience. So I'll start in the order they were asked, and I'll start with Simeon. So Simeon, the first question for you was whether there are any reasons why you believe the US results from the research you referred to might not be replicated in the UK, whether there are any differences in key institutional arrangements, why those results might not apply to the UK.
Well, I think, first of all, it's a question I raise rather than a conclusion I draw. And I think it is an open question. And I think there's two sort of dimensions of interest. One is applicability from one platform to another, and then the other is from one geography, the US to the UK. I think the platform question is probably an easier one to answer, in that insofar as the concern is the particular operation of the algorithm leads to an adverse impact, then different algorithms, there's no reason to believe that they will lead to the same impact. Indeed, on the contrary, as I suggested, and I think Rasmus's talk also provides evidence for, I think there is a reason to believe that some types of algorithm, particularly the kind of search algorithm that's not associated with personal data, would not tend to lead to these kind of feedback loops in a way that some of the social media algorithms may do. Now, in terms of geographies, it's an interesting question. So, to what extent would we expect results in the US to be replicated in the UK? I think the reason for me that it's a sort of open question, and one that we should explore, is that the political fault lines in the UK are obviously different to those in the US. Just looking at recent years, Brexit is a big thing in the UK in a way it's not in the US. The impact of President Trump's obviously bigger news in the US. And insofar as these effects take place through a feedback loop between people's views and interests and the operation of the algorithms, then I think you could imagine a situation in which even the same algorithm would operate and have very different effects in different geographies. So as I say, I'm not concluding that that is the case, but I think it is a reason for us trying to replicate these sorts of methodologies, particularly the gold standard evidence approaches of trials in the UK, to assess whether we are seeing the same sorts of impacts.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question, we have a couple of questions actually for Andrea. The next one is that Andrea makes the point that partisanship can be significant in a statistical sense in terms of being better informed, but is it meaningful? It seems to be suggesting that so many Americans are disengaged is more significant for thinking about media plurality rather than what may be happening with informed parties. I'm not. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, did you have an?
No, I wasn't entirely clear on the question, but maybe I'll leave it to you to interpret.
So I think I don't think the polarization effect is small, because that 3% gap between Democrats and Republicans on whether they know strongly Democrat or strongly Republican stories is significant and not small. My main point is that the other one is much larger, and somehow it has been forgotten in the recent debate. The recent debate has focused a lot on this horizontal dimension polarization and on fake versus real news, and it has forgotten a dimension that was central to the debate actually in the 80s and earlier, which is just this inequality dimension. And I was really surprised that I want to make sure I get that information right. So that's a question for Rasmus, whose presentation I really liked. I understood that 50% of the subjects in your study never click on any of the 21 websites. I think this is, in a sense, we're sort of getting to the same issue from different directions. I was looking at absorption, and I see that around 40% of Americans don't know much, and you see that 50% of British people don't click on any news website. It feels like the two things are correlated. It would be great, of course, to put them together, and it feels like this is to me, it's the elephant in the room, the fact that we have a lot of disengaged people, and I would be interested also to know from Rasmus what these people look like in various ways, and I think this is a big policy question. Julia Cagé, in her book, has tried to tackle it. What should we do in terms of public policy about that? In our work for the Stigler Committee on the media, we've tried to think about it. What should we do? And and of course, this answer is going to depend very much on the country you're looking at. But for the US, we very much advocate the idea of media vouchers, the idea of giving people a certain amount of money per month that can be used to purchase the kind of media, the kind of news that works best for them. And we think that that will have two effects. First of all, it will lower the access barrier, and it will also force mainstream media to cater not just to the usual people right now. I mean, the truth is that newspapers are bought by old white people in the US, and so that's who they cater for. And so that's one idea that I think we should be thinking about.
Brilliant, thank you. You also answered the next question, which was, what do you think we should do about your results? So I'll move on to Roman. First question for you, Roman, is whether you could say a bit more about the possibility of introducing interoperability into algorithmic curation, which Twitter was working on in the Blue Sky initiative, in terms of users choosing their own curation of their timeline on the basis, for example, of public interest criteria developed and defined through a multi-stakeholder process rather than a single body deciding what is acceptable. Indeed, views from all speakers will be very much appreciated on that. We only have just over 5 minutes left, so perhaps not all speakers, but let's start with Roman.
Sure, and thank you to whoever raised this question. So to give people a bit of background, a few years ago, Jack Dorsey, our former CEO, was in front of Congress and introduced a concept called algorithmic choice. Algorithmic choice, very simply put, and the way Jack had put it, is this concept of a third-party app store for algorithms. So that's sort of the simplest way of understanding what it could be. But then when you think through what the application and the implication of that would be, especially vis-a-vis the content we're talking about here, what that does is places social media companies in a position of essentially being the arbiter of an app store. So the question is, do you want to be an Android or do you want to be an Apple? The Android app store traditionally is very buyer beware, right? You go in and you don't know, they have lower regulations and they have increasingly added standards, but the very early days of Android app store was just kind of built an app and you put it out there. And the idea was that the market would kind of correct itself. And that's led to a lot of malware, corruption. And actually there's a big article in the Wall Street Journal today about all these tracking apps that had to be taken down from the Android app store, particularly targeting Muslim Americans and Muslims in general. The second version is the Apple store, which is significantly highly regulated, which then, of course, introduces barriers to entry, which a lot of startup founders, et cetera, have found to be overly onerous. So that's one question that it raises. Second is, with regard to Blue Sky and interoperability, in general, agreed. I think the concept there's something really there in the concept. And it is actually a very radical reimagining of our relationship with social media. So currently the way social media is constructed versus how the internet or the idea of a web browser or a search engine is constructed, actually quite different, right? So if you are Google or DuckDuckGo or somebody offering a portal by which you access websites, there is no assumption that they are responsible for the content of the internet. They are responsible for their algorithm curates. And that's a really important distinction from social media companies, because social media companies are responsible for the content on it, not just the curation. So just to put a very blunt example is neo-Nazis are allowed to live on the internet. People think neo-Nazis are not allowed to live on Twitter. They're not allowed to have an account. They should not be posting, etc. Nobody would actually say that about the internet. You are allowed to carve out your little hateful part of the internet as long as the browser does not allow you to access it, because that we will have issue with. So it's an interesting different relationship, and what that means for things like content moderation change very significantly. And that's, like I said, a pretty radical reimagining. So to go from theoretical to applied, I wish I could talk more about algorithmic amplification, because my team actually owns that work. And we will be releasing a white paper on it, and as well as some interesting news on it, hopefully in this, I want to say the coming months, but maybe this, definitely this year. But, it is something that we have been looking at and thinking through quite deeply. And here's how it might look. It might look something like the initial steps, via using privacy enhancing tech and these interoperability mechanisms to allow trusted third parties to access Twitter data or data in general to make better or different versions of algorithms curated for specific purposes. That's one prospective example. Why I used very careful language there. Today, the information available via our API on Twitter would not actually allow anybody to make any sort of an algorithm or model that would even remotely be competitive to Twitter's. So we do actually have to understand what is the space in which we are working. You need access to data, whether it is on our end, researchers wanting access to the data we use to understand algorithmic amplification, or on a bigger scale, a third party wanting access to the kind of data Twitter uses in order to create an alternative timeline. Now, of course, that starts to bump into privacy and security. What sort of data can and should we be sharing? Can and should we be sharing this, and how does it align with existing privacy and security laws and upcoming privacy and security laws? So all of these things kind of need to be balanced. Again, that is something that will also be a multi-year journey, but I'm very excited that we will be releasing something about it in the coming months.
Wonderful. Many thanks, Roman. And I'm really, really sorry that we've only got just a couple of minutes left, because it really would be fascinating to hear more. And perhaps this is an opportunity to invite you to follow up once you publish your next research. And really a huge shout out for Twitter, who's been very, very open. And as Rasmus mentioned, the only one platform to share very openly the results of its research, which is enormously important for researchers and for us as Ofcom as we prepare to regulate for online safety. So before thanking everyone, I just wanted to give Rasmus 1 minute to possibly answer the final question for him about whether he was surprised about the difference in results.
Thank you. I have to say I probably wasn't, because this is sort of by now, I think, is sort of the consensus amongst empirical media researchers. I'm very proud that we've contributed to that consensus. As I always say to journalists, cover the consensus and not the studies. And that we've done it with an unprecedented level of granularity and precision, because this is the first such study in the UK. I would say more broadly that I think one of the problems in this space, sort of both from a sort of public debate point of view and from a policy point of view, is that there's sort of two features. One is that we have sort of more than half a century of media and communications research, much of it very good, but much of it very empirical, which is sort of roundly ignored because it seems that sort of elites who dominate public debate and policymakers sometimes don't know that there is half a century of research to draw on, and then we sort of overlook some very low-hanging fruits that we could benefit from in this space. The other one is, I think that, and this would include some of the research I've been involved in myself, is that sometimes I think scientists are very easy to annoy and irritate. And when we hear people say stupid things in public, we make it our work to sort of debunk it. And I think we've probably over-indexed on the debunking of sort of bullshit, if you'll excuse my French, of sort of people who've coined terms and written op-eds in various publications that are happy to publish those op-eds. And then we sort of take 3 years to debunk them. And then in the meantime, they've written 5 new op-eds, launching 5 new concepts. And actually, I suppose I very much agree with the general thrust of Andrea's presentation, that it seems to me that the more fundamental issue that we face is growing information inequality in a world in which people have unprecedented choice. And because many people are deeply disappointed and with and alienated from mainstream politics and mainstream media, they are using that freedom to choose other things that I think scientists would sometimes say don't always equip them to be citizens in a way that where they might do something about their disappointment. And to Andrea's question about who they are, I mean, they are, as you would expect, often people who are alienated from mainstream politics. They're younger people with lower levels of formal education, lower levels of income, and minorities of various sorts. And I think we have to accept that empirically the research suggests media are not serving them well.
I'm very, very sorry I have to jump in because we're about to be cut off. Just a huge thank you from me, from Ofcom, to all our speakers and our audience. Many thanks for joining us today and for sharing, very fascinating thoughts and research. And until next year, thank you. Goodbye.